October 2025 became one of the most active months for executions in the United States in more than a decade. 7 men were executed across multiple states in just a few weeks, as executions reached their highest level in years. In this video, we'll look at the cases behind those executions, the crimes, the victims, the legal process, and the final moments, including last meals and last words. Before we begin, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. 1. Roy Lee Ward, State, Indiana, executed by lethal injection. On July 11, 2001, in the small town of Dale, Indiana, 15-year-old Stacy Payne was tragically murdered by Roy Lee Ward. Ward knocked on her door, claiming to look for a lost dog. Once inside, he brutally attacked Stacy with a knife and dumbbell, ending her young life in a violent and senseless act. This is one of the most horrific death row inmates executed in 2025. In this video, we'll walk you through the entire crime, the trial, and the execution itself. Roy Lee Ward had a history of troubling behavior long before the crime. He had been involved in indecent exposure and other sexually inappropriate acts, signaling serious psychological issues. Despite multiple legal encounters, Ward's behavior was never fully addressed, and by 2001, he was on probation for a previous crime when he attacked Stacy. Stacy Payne, a 15-year-old honor student and cheerleader, was loved by her community and had a bright future ahead of her. She had no connection to Ward, who was simply a stranger. When he arrived at her home pretending to look for a lost dog, Stacy unknowingly let him inside, unaware of the danger he posed. Ward's motive wasn't about anger or a random outburst. It was about control. His past was filled with disturbing behavior that showed his growing need to dominate others. The attack on Stacy wasn't a momentary lapse of judgment. It was a result of his long-standing desire to assert power over someone he viewed as vulnerable. Ward's lack of empathy for Stacy and his indifference to her suffering revealed the depth of his psychological detachment. On the afternoon of July 11, 2001, Roy Lee Ward arrived at Stacy Payne's home in Dale, Indiana, claiming he was looking for a lost dog. Stacy, a 15-year-old honor student and cheerleader, answered the door, unaware of the danger lurking behind the innocent-sounding request. Once inside, Ward cut the phone lines, trapping Stacy inside with him and leaving her unable to call for help. Ward's actions were not impulsive. They were calculated. The way he isolated Stacy and controlled the situation from the very start highlights his psychological need for dominance. He didn't simply assault her in a moment of rage. His behavior was methodical, driven by a need to overpower someone weaker. The cutting of the phone lines, the use of multiple weapons, and the restraint of his victim showed a disturbing level of control. Ward then proceeded to violently assault Stacy, using both a knife and a dumbbell. The attack was brutal, and Stacy suffered severe injuries. Among the most serious was a deep wound to her throat, which left her struggling to breathe and fighting for her life. Despite the intensity of the assault, Stacy remained conscious for a period, trying to hold on as she pleaded for mercy. This act was not one of impulsive rage, but rather the culmination of Ward's long-standing psychological issues. His lack of empathy for Stacy's suffering and the cold, detached manner in which he carried out the attack speak to his deep psychological detachment. For him, Stacy wasn't a person with a life, dreams, and a family. She was simply a target for him to control. Ward's psychological detachment allowed him to continue inflicting pain without any emotional reaction, revealing a sadistic need for control and dominance. As Stacy fought for her life, her younger sister, Melissa, who was upstairs, heard the screams and immediately called 911. When the police arrived, they found Ward standing in the doorway, covered in blood, with a knife still in his hand. He was arrested without resistance. Ward made no effort to flee, showing a chilling indifference to the crime he had just committed. His lack of remorse and the calmness with which he surrendered to authorities were early indicators of his psychological detachment from the reality of his actions. And Stacy was found unconscious and critically injured despite medical efforts. Stacy passed away shortly after from her injuries. As the case proceeded to trial, Ward's legal journey became a prolonged and complex process. In 2002, He was convicted and sentenced to death, but the conviction was later overturned by the Indiana Supreme Court in 2004 due to pretrial publicity. A new trial was ordered, but by the time it began in 2007, Ward pleaded guilty to the charges of rape and murder, accepting responsibility for his actions. This was seen as an attempt to avoid another lengthy trial, but also as an acknowledgement of his deep-seated psychological issues. Throughout the legal proceedings, Ward's defense team argued that he had a history of mental illness, including a diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder. His attorney suggested that his social and emotional impairments may have influenced how he acted during the attack. However, the prosecution countered that Ward's actions were not the result of mental illness, but were instead driven by a sadistic need for control and his complete lack of empathy for the victim. Despite the defense's efforts, the jury once again sentenced Ward to death, citing the brutality of the crime and a lack of remorse shown by Ward. Throughout this period, his psychopathic tendencies became more evident. Even after conviction, Ward maintained an emotionally detached stance, rarely showing any true regret for what he had done. His psychological makeup suggested that for him, the crime was an act of asserting control rather than the result of an emotional outburst. After years of legal challenges and delays, Roy Lee Ward was finally executed on October 10, 2025, marking the end of a long legal battle. At 12:01 a.m., he was brought to the Indiana State Prison in Michigan City, where he was executed by lethal injection. This marked the conclusion of a process that had taken over 2 decades of appeals, court reviews, and denied clemency requests. Ward's final meal was from Texas Corral, consisting of a hamburger, steak melt, French fries, baked potato with butter, 12 fried shrimp, a sweet potato, chicken Alfredo, and breadsticks, a relatively lavish request compared to the gravity of the crimes he committed. His final words, according to officials, were simply, "Brian is going to read them," referring to his spiritual advisor, Deacon Brian Nosebush, who was present during the execution. As the lethal injection was administered, Ward's reaction was calm and almost indifferent. His hand turned blue, and within moments, he was pronounced dead at 12:33 a.m. His physical reaction, or lack of it, was a stark contrast to what one might expect in such a moment. Ward's lack of emotional distress in his final moments mirrored the psychological detachment he had displayed throughout the entire process. For the family of Stacey Payne, decades of grief and uncertainty finally met a grim sense of closure.
There is a quote that says, "Time heals all wounds," but that absolutely is not true in this case.
Her mother, Julie Winninger, described the years since Stacey's death as filled with emotional devastation, where family gatherings and holidays were reminders of the life they lost. When news of Ward's execution came, it was met with a mixture of relief and lingering sorrow. Though justice had been served, the absence of Stacey could never be replaced. During the execution, a small group of anti-death penalty activists gathered outside the prison, reading scriptures and ringing bells in silent protest. Inside, only a few family members and legal representatives were permitted. For Stacey's family, witnessing Ward's final moments was a powerful and emotional experience, not of vengeance, but of acknowledging the end of a long legal struggle and the fulfillment of the justice system. From a psychological perspective, Ward's detachment and lack of visible remorse likely compounded the family's pain. For someone like him, empathy is absent, so he could face the end of his life without understanding or feeling the depth of suffering he caused. This emotional void, consistent throughout his life, made Stacey's family confrontation with him emotionally complex. They faced the knowledge that the person responsible for their loss had never truly recognized the human impact of his actions. The calm and calculated demeanor that Ward had shown during the execution only underscored the cold, detached nature of the individual they had spent years pursuing through the courts, making the experience emotionally intense but meaningful. This concludes the story of Roy Lee Ward and the tragic case of Stacey Payne. From the crime to the execution, we've explored the events, the legal journey, and the psychological forces that shaped this case. While justice was ultimately carried out, the impact on the victim's family and community serves as a powerful reminder of the consequences of unchecked violence. 2. Samuel Lee Smithers, State, Florida, executed by lethal injection. On a quiet morning in May 1996, police in Plant City, Florida, made a chilling discovery. 2 women were found in a pond, beaten, strangled, and left to sink beneath the muddy water. Their killer wasn't a stranger. He was a church deacon, a man who preached faith by day and hid his crimes by night. Samuel Lee Smithers. This is a story of faith turned to violence, and of how a man once seen as righteous became known as the Deacon of Death. Before the murders, Samuel Lee Smithers lived what seemed like a quiet, faithful life. Born in Tennessee in 1953, he grew up in a home marked by violence and fear. His father abused his mother, and his mother used religion as punishment, whipping her children in what she called acts of cleansing. As a man, Smithers became a husband, a father, and a church deacon in Plant City, Florida. To his neighbors, he was gentle, always smiling, always talking about faith. But behind that calm image, something dark was building. Years before the murders, he had already shown signs of trouble. He was arrested for setting fires, including one at a church, and later admitted the act gave him a strange sense of excitement. He also lost his position at church after being accused of offering favors in exchange for sex. By 1996, Smithers' perfect image had started to crack. He was struggling financially, his reputation in the community fading. He spent more time alone, working as a landscaper on a quiet property outside of town. That's where he met Denise Roach, a 24-year-old mother of 2, and Christy Cowan, 31, a former nurse trying to survive. Both women worked the streets near a Tampa motel. Smithers paid them for sex, but what began as brief encounters soon too reneged deadly. Investigators say that Smithers didn't just kill them out of anger. He killed them to feel in control again. The women represented everything he was taught to fear and hate: sin, temptation, and weakness. To the world, he was still the man of God, but inside, he was already breaking, a preacher who couldn't save himself. On the morning of May 28, 1996, a property owner in Plant City stopped by to check on her land. She expected to find her landscaper finishing up work. Instead, she found Samuel Lee Smithers standing in the carport cleaning an axe. Near his feet, she noticed a dark stain on the concrete. When she asked, he smiled and said, "Someone must have killed a small animal here." Something in his tone didn't sound right. Hours later, police arrived. The blood had been scrubbed away, but drag marks led straight from the carport to a nearby pond. When divers entered the water, they pulled up the body of Christy Cowan, a 31-year-old mother who had disappeared just days earlier. Beneath her, they found another body, 24-year-old Denise Roach, missing for more than 2 weeks. Both women had been beaten and strangled, their bodies left beneath the muddy surface of the pond. Investigators soon connected the dots. Smithers had met both women at a Tampa motel where he often stopped for sex. He brought them, one after another, to that same remote property, a place he knew no one would question him being at. Forensic evidence later showed both victims were attacked near the carport, then dragged to the water. Smithers used the same tools he worked with: an axe, a hoe, weapons of convenience turned into instruments of control. To the police, it was clear this wasn't a crime of passion. It was patterned, almost ritualistic. Each step repeated with precision: lure, attack, hide, cleanse. Investigators believed the pond symbolized something to him, a place to erase what he thought was sin. He didn't just want the women gone. He wanted them washed away. When confronted, Smithers claimed it was all a mistake. That one woman fell, that another attacked him first. But the evidence told a colder truth. He had complete control from beginning to end. What shocked the community most wasn't just what he did, it was who he was. The man who once led prayers at church had turned his faith into a mask, and his hands into weapons. The discovery of 2 bodies in that quiet pond left detectives with one name: Samuel Lee Smithers. Within a day, They trace a connection to both victims and place him under arrest. The man once known for reading the Bible in church now sat under bright interrogation lights, answering questions from homicide detectives. He didn't ask for a lawyer. He didn't cry. He just sat there, calm, polite, and completely detached. Investigators searched the property where he worked. Beneath the carport floor, luminol revealed traces of blood that had been washed away. Near the pond, they found pieces of clothing, tire tracks, and tool marks matching his equipment. Everything pointed back to him. News of his arrest spread quickly through Plant City. Church members who once trusted him refused to believe it. "He baptized my children," one woman said. "He couldn't hurt anyone." But the courtroom told a different story. During his trial in late 1998, prosecutors described Smithers as a man who lived a double life, using religion to mask his violence. They called the killings methodical, deliberate, and cruel. The defense tried to show another side, a childhood filled with beatings, a man scarred by brain injuries, trapped in guilt and confusion. They asked for mercy. The jury found none. After 4 days of testimony and evidence, Smithers was found guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder. The man once trusted with prayers would now spend the rest of his life waiting for one. That would never come. After 26 years on death row, Samuel Lee Smithers' time finally ran out. On the evening of October 14th, 2025, at Florida State Prison, the man once known as the Deacon of Death faced his final hour. Witnesses watched as the curtain lifted at exactly 6 p.m. Smithers was already strapped to the table, for lines running down his arm. When the warden asked if he had any last words, he replied softly, "No, sir." For his final meal, Smithers made a strange, almost lifeless request. Peanut butter, 3 packs of oatmeal, water, and 2 sports drinks. No comfort food, no dessert, no sign of reflection. It was simple, cold, and empty, like the man he had become. At 6:15 p.m., the drugs entered his system. His breathing slowed, his body tensed, and then fell still. A medic stepped forward, checked for a pulse, and pronounced him dead. Outside the prison, there were no crowds, no cheers, no tears, just silence. For some, justice had finally been served. For others, it was simply the end of a long, dark chapter that had begun nearly 30 years before. The man who once preached about salvation had met his own judgment, not in a church, but on a cold steel table, beneath the same sky he once prayed you. Ender. For the families of Christy Cowan and Denise Roach, the news came quietly. No celebration, no relief, just a brief call from the Department of Corrections confirming that Samuel Lee Smithers was gone. Christy's father once said he never wanted the death penalty. He hoped Smithers would spend the rest of his life in a cell, facing what he'd done. But that never appeased. Smithers never apologized, never spoke their names again. Denise's relatives called the execution a final breath of justice. Yet even they admitted it didn't bring peace, only closure on paper. The pain, they said, doesn't fade when the killer dies. It just goes quiet for a while. In Plant City, few people talked about the execution. The church where Smithers once served removed his name from every record. Some members said they forgave him. Others said forgiveness wasn't theirs to give. Outside the prison that night, no one held signs or candles. Just a hum of traffic passing on a dark Florida highway, and the faint sound of rain falling on the concrete. After 26 years, the story had finally ended. But for the families who lost everything, the silence that followed was heavier than the verdict itself. In the end, Samuel Lee Smithers became a symbol of something far darker than his crimes alone. He showed how faith, when twisted by guilt and control, can lose its soul. 2 women died because one man believed he could decide who was pure and who was not. For that belief, he spent half his life behind bars, waiting for the same mercy he never gave. Justice was served, but justice doesn't heal. It simply closes the door on a story that should never have happened. In the quiet after his death, What remains are not his final words, but the lives that were stolen, and a reminder that sometimes the real evil hides not in the shadows, but behind a smile, a prayer, and a trusted name. This was the story of Samuel Lee Smithers, the Deacon of Death, a tale of faith, betrayal, and the darkness that can live behind a trusted face. March 20th, 2005, a quiet night in Van Buren, Missouri. Sergeant Carl Dwayne Graham Jr. had just returned home after work, but before he could reach his door, 3 gunshots rang out. Moments later, the respected state trooper lay still in his own driveway. The man accused was Lance Colin Shockley, a local under investigation for a deadly crash. What began as fear became a tragedy that would haunt Missouri for 20 years. This is a case of Lance Shockley, and the night 3 shots changed everything. Before that night, Lance Colin Shockley was not a man anyone feared. Born in 1977, he grew up near the Current River in Van Buren, Missouri, a small town where everyone knew everyone. He liked being outdoors boating and spending quiet time by the water. People described him as friendly, ordinary, maybe too ordinary to imagine what would come next. But life changed in November 2004. Shockley went for a drive with Jeffrey Bayless, his sister-in-law's fiancé. The car crashed. Bayless died. Shockley survived and ran. Beer cans and a tequila bottle were found in the wreck. Investigators believed he had been drinking, and the man leading that investigation was Sergeant Carl Dwayne Graham Jr. Graham was known as calm and disciplined, a 12-year veteran of the Missouri State Highway Patrol. He had started closing in on Shockley, preparing to question him again about the fatal crash. But to a man like Shockley, that wasn't just an investigation. It felt like a trap closing in. Inside, fear began to grow. He feared losing everything, his freedom, his family, his reputation in a town where everyone talks. That fear slowly turned into pressure and then into panic. Psychologists call it defensive fear, when a person's anxiety builds until the mind sees only one way out. In his own mind, Shockley wasn't planning revenge. He was trying to escape humiliation and the future he believed was coming for him. But fear can twist logic. It can make a man believe that removing one problem will make the rest disappear. And in March 2005, that fear was about to lead to something irreversible. It was a quiet night in Van Buren. Sergeant Carl Dwayne Graham Jr. had just finished his patrol shift. He drove home, parked, and stepped out his car just a few feet from his front door. Somewhere nearby, someone was waiting, a man who had spent months living under pressure, convinced his world was about to fall apart. That man was Lance Colin Shockley. According to investigators, he was afraid of being arrested for a deadly crash. He believed Graham's next move would ruin his life. That fear grew into anger, and anger found a weapon. Shockley had borrowed a red Pontiac Grand AM from his grandmother. Neighbors later told police they saw a red car parked close to Graham's house that night. When Graham got home, the stillness of the street broke. 3 shots. Moments later, Graham lay on the ground. The evidence showed the shots came from behind. He never had a chance to defend himself. Investigators said the attack looked planned, an ambush driven by fear, not madness. Shockley left the scene quietly, disappearing into the night. He wasn't found until 3 days later. From a psychological view, this was the breaking point. Fear had changed form. It was no longer silent. It became action. In that moment, Shockley's mind likely wasn't focused on what was right or wrong. It was focused only on survival, distorted by panic and the desperate need to escape. Psychologists call it collapse of moral control, when anxiety takes the place of judgment. And once it happens, there is no way back. When the noise faded that night, a respected officer was gone, a community was shaken, and a man who once feared being trapped had just trapped himself forever. 3 days after the shooting, police arrested Lance Colin Shockley. He didn't fight back. He said little, and his face showed almost no emotion. It was as if the storm inside him had already passed. He was charged with first-degree murder and armed criminal action. By the end of March 2005, prosecutors announced they would seek the death penalty. But it took 4 long years before the trial began. In March 2009, inside a small Missouri courtroom, 12 jurors listened to 2 stories. The state said it was a planned ambush, an act meant to silence a trooper who was closing in. The defense said the evidence was circumstantial, built from guesses and fear. No one had seen Shockley pull the trigger, but the details painted a heavy picture. A red car near the scene, shell fragments matching his family's property, and a man with a clear reason to be afraid of Sergeant Graham's investigation. After hours of deliberation, the jury found him guilty of first-degree murder. But when it came to punishment, they couldn't agree. The decision fell to Judge David Evans, who sentenced Shockley to death in May 2009. From that moment, time began to stretch. For years, Shockley lived on death row, appealing to every court that would listen: the Missouri Supreme Court, the 8th Circuit, and even the U.S. Supreme Court. Each time, the answer was the same: denied. In 2025, his lawyers asked for DNA testing on evidence that had never been analyzed. A cigarette butt, fingerprints, a cell phone, tiny fragment from the scene. They argued that modern science could reveal the truth, but the courts refused to delay his execution. Through it all, Shockley maintained his innocence. He spoke softly, often through prayer, and told his daughters he believed God knew the truth. In the eyes of the law, his guilt was final, but in his own mind, the case was still unfinished. A battle between justice, fear, and faith that would soon reach its final day. October 14, 2025. After 20 years on death row, Lance Colin Shockley woke up to his final day. That morning, he met his 2 daughters and a close friend. They held hands, prayed together, and said their goodbyes. He didn't cry. He thanked them for coming. Around 11 a.m., he had his last meal: simple items from the prison canteen: peanut butter, 3 packs of oatmeal, water, and 2 sports drinks. It wasn't a meal of celebration. It was quiet, almost humble. Missouri Governor Mike Kehoe had denied his clemency request the day before. No more appeals. No more delays. At 6:13 p.m., inside the Eastern Reception Diagnostic and Correctional Center in Bonne Terre, Shockley was executed by lethal injection. His final words came from the Bible, the Gospel of John, chapter 16, verse 22. So also you have sorrow now, but I will see you again, and your hearts will rejoice, and no one will take your joy from you. Psychologists call this stage acceptance, the moment when fear gives way to faith, when the mind stops fighting and begins to let go. Witnesses said he looked calm, almost peaceful. For some, it was justice served. For others, it was sorrow renewed. At 6:13 p.m., the 20-year chapter of this case finally closed, leaving behind silence and questions that will never fully fade. When the announcement came at 6:13 p.m., Lance Colin Shockley is deceased. 2 families felt the weight of 20 years lift and settle in a different way. For Graham family, it was the end of a long wait. They had carried grief since March 2005 for a husband, a son, a trooper who never came home. In a statement read by the Missouri Highway Patrol, they said, "No court proceeding can bring Dwayne back. But after all these years, there is some peace knowing this part is finally over." Colonel Michael Turner of the Highway Patrol added, "Tonight marks the end of a 20-year chapter for Dwayne's family, and for an entire state he dedicated his life to protecting. For them, it was justice, solemn, not celebratory. But for the Shockley family, that same moment carried a different kind of pain. His daughter, Summer Shockley, had spent her life visiting her father behind glass, listening to him pray, and believing in his innocence. She once said, "I was already living in grief before anything even happened." In June, just months before the execution, she saw him one last time during a special family visit. They played games, laughed, and prayed together. Then, only 30 minutes after she drove home, the call came. His execution date was set. Summer and her sister chose to attend the execution, not out of anger, but love, a need to be there when the story ended. Two families, two very different prayers, both touched by the same night, 20 years apart, and both left with the same truth, that justice, in any form, never feels like healing. In the end, this story isn't just about guilt or innocence. It's about fear, loss, and what we call justice. Maybe real justice is simply the end of waiting, a door quietly closing after 20 long years. And when the silence returns, we're left asking the same question. Does justice bring peace or just an ending? For Charles Ray Crawford, State, Mississippi, executed by lethal injection. January 29th, 1993, Tippah County, Mississippi. Christy Denise Ray vanished from her home within minutes of arriving from work. The suspect, Charles Ray Crawford, was days away from standing trial, but instead, he unleashed another act of violence that would horrify an entire state. This is a case of Charles Ray Crawford, and the night a young woman's life ended in silence and fear. To understand how this could happen, we have to go back. Long before that January evening in 1993, Christy Denise Ray was 20 years old, born in Germany, raised in Mississippi, a bright college student, part-time bank employee, and only child of Mary and Tommy Ray. She loved helping people. She smiled easily. She had plans to finish school, to build a life. Charles Ray Crawford was 26, a man whose life looked normal from the outside. Twice married, one son, steady work. But beneath that, something darker was building. 2 years earlier, in 1991, Crawford had attacked two teenage girls. One of them was his ex-wife's sister. Then, he was arrested and set to stand trial in February 1993. As his trial drew closer, Crawford's anger grew. The thought of facing justice made him restless, unstable. Fear turned into rage, and that rage pushed him toward another violent impulse he couldn't control. So 4 days before his trial, Charles Ray Crawford broke into another home, one belonging to a young woman he didn't even know. There was no connection between them. Christy Ray was a random victim, caught in the path of a man terrified of losing control. Investigators later said it wasn't about lust or money. It was about domination, a violent attempt to rewrite the ending of his own story by destroying someone else's. That's the moment fear turned to violence, and a young woman's kindness met a man's cruelty. It was Friday evening, January 29th, 1993. Christy Ray had just finished work at the bank, where her mother also worked. They left together, smiling, planning dinner at home. But within an hour, everything changed. When her mother came home later that night, the house was quiet, too quiet. Christy's car was gone. The window screen was cut open, and on the kitchen table, a ransom note demanding $15,000. Police arrived within minutes. They searched the home, the woods, the roads, nothing. It was as if Christy had vanished into thin air. But investigators would soon learn this was no random disappearance. The man behind it, Charles Ray Crawford, was already spiraling out of control. 4 days from standing trial for another violent assault, he broke into Christy's home and took her by force. Crawford drove her to an abandoned barn deep in the woods of Tippah County. There, he handcuffed her to a pine tree, gagged her, and assaulted her. The final act was deliberate. One stab wound straight through her heart and left lung. Precise, cold, calculated. He buried her body under a pile of leaves and fled. When investigators traced the ransom note, it led straight to him. His family had found another note, made from magazine cutouts, hidden in their attic that same day. They turned it in, and within 24 hours, police closed in. Crawford didn't fight. He simply said, "She's gone. I'll show you where." He led officers through the woods and stopped beside a mound of leaves. That's where they found Christy. Psychologists later said his behavior followed a pattern seen in violent offenders facing loss of control. The crime wasn't about passion or even hatred. It was about reclaiming power, no matter who had to suffer for it. In one night, a young woman's future ended, and a man's darkness finally came into full view. In 1994, the trial began. It was moved to another county. The town was too angry, too heartbroken to stay neutral. Crawford's defense claimed he was insane, that he had blackouts, that he didn't remember killing her. But prosecutors called it what it was: deliberate control violence. They showed the ransom note written days before. The rope, the tape, the single, perfect stab wound. Nothing about it was madness. It was method. A prison psychiatrist said Crawford had once been treated for depression and bipolar disorder, but other doctors testified there was no true sign of insanity. Only a man who understood right from wrong, and chose wrong anyway. On April 23, 1994, the jury returned their verdict. Guilty on all counts: capital murder, rape, and burglary. He was sentenced to death by lethal injection. Over the next 3 decades, Crawford filed appeal after appeal, each one rejected by state and federal courts. The system moved slowly, but justice never forgot his name. And as the years passed, the question changed. Not if he'd be executed, but when. October 15, 2025, Mississippi State Penitentiary, Parchman. 30 years after the murder of Christy Ray, the sentence was finally carried out. Charles Ray Crawford ate his last meal: a double cheeseburger, French fries, peach cobbler, and chocolate ice cream. He said little that day, quiet, calm, almost attached. Some said he looked at peace. Others saw only emptiness. At 6:01 p.m., the injection began. He whispered his final words. "To my family, I love you. I'm at peace." To the victim's family, true peace. You cannot reach that without God. At 6:15, he was pronounced dead. Witnesses described the room as silent. No movement, no reaction, only the sound of the clock and the closing curtain. Psychologists say some offenders face death with calm because their mind attaches. They create distance between who they were and what they did. But peace is not always the same as remorse. And silence does not always mean acceptance. That night, as the lights dimmed inside Parchman Prison, the state of Mississippi closed one of its longest-running cases. Justice had spoken, though the pain it left behind would echo far longer than the sound of that closing door. In the witness room, behind a pane of glass, Mary Ray watched as the curtain opened. 30 years of waiting had led to this one quiet moment. Her husband, Tommy, was too sick to attend. She went alone. When it was over, reporters asked her how she felt. She spoke softly. "I don't like the word closure. I have a hole in my heart as big as my heart that will never be closed." Outside the prison, a handful of protesters stood in silence. Some prayed for justice. Others prayed for mercy. But no one cheered. There was no joy in it, only the stillness that follows a storm. For the Ray family, the execution didn't bring peace. It only ended a chapter that had already taken too much. Their daughter was gone. The memories of who she was, bright, kind, full of promise, were all that remained. 30 years after her death, the pain had not faded. It had only learned how to stay quiet. And in that silence, Mary Ray carried on, not with closure, but with love that never found its ending. For the courts, the case was over. The sentence had been carried out. But for those who loved Christy, justice fell heavy, like a word too sharp to hold. The presiding judge once called Crawford's crime cold, deliberate, and beyond rehabilitation. And the Attorney General said, "Justice was served, but the pain remains." 30 years had passed. Yet grief doesn't measure time. It lives in silence, in birthdays never celebrated, in empty chairs at family tables. Psychologists say some wounds never close. They simply become part of who we are. Maybe that's what justice truly means. Not healing, but learning to live with what's left. For Christy's family, the verdict was final, but the loss was forever. 5. Richard Kenneth Djerf, State, Arizona, executed by lethal injection.
Do you want to watch your kid die? Or do you want your kid to watch you die?
That line didn't come from a movie. It was spoken inside a real family home in Phoenix, Arizona. On September 14, 1993, 4 members of the Luna were murdered in a single planned act of revenge. The man behind it was 23-year-old Richard Kenneth Djerf, someone the family once knew, even close friend. What turned this case into one of the most disturbing family murders in Arizona's history? To understand what happened in that house, we have to step back and look at the man who walked through the door. Richard Kenneth Djerf was born in Phoenix, Arizona, in 1969. In 1993, he was 23 years old, young, physically healthy, and living an ordinary life on the surface. No history of severe mental illness. No story of a brutal childhood to explain what he did later. In fact, years before his execution, he told a reporter, "I'm not crazy. I don't hear voices. I didn't have a terrible childhood. I just did what I did." That sentence says a lot. He wasn't claiming insanity. He wasn't blaming his past. He was a man who made a choice, and he knew it. The key connection in this case is his relationship with Albert Luna Jr., the only surviving member of the Luna family. They weren't strangers. They had once been close, co-workers. But about 9 months before the murders, they had a conflict. Electronics and a gun went missing from his apartment. Richard became convinced that Albert Jr. was the one who stole them. Later, in court, Albert Jr. would admit to the burglary. For most people, a theft, even a serious one, leads to anger, maybe a fight, maybe a police report. But for Richard, he didn't just feel robbed. He felt betrayed. He decided that someone had crossed a line and that he had the right to balance the scales himself. Over the next months, that idea grew inside him. He replayed the story in his head. I trusted him. He stole from me. Nobody is fixing it, so I will. Instead of seeing one man who made a bad choice, he slowly turned the entire Luna family into symbols of that betrayal, made them become the target. By the morning of September 14th, 1993, he wasn't just angry about stolen property anymore. He was ready to walk up to their door, look them in the eyes, and make them pay for a story that had been playing in his head for far too long. On the morning of September 14th, 1993, Richard Kenneth Djerf went to the Luna family home with a clear plan. He walked up to the door carrying flowers, a simple way to make himself look friendly. When Patricia Luna opened the door, thinking someone was delivering something kind, she instead found herself face to face with a gun. In a matter of seconds, the balance of power inside the house changed. Richard forced his way in and took control of the situation. Inside the kitchen, Patricia and her 5-year-old son Damien were tied to chairs, so they couldn't move or get help, just sitting in fear, waiting for what would happen next. Around early afternoon, their teenage daughter Rochelle came home from school. She walked in like it was any other day and found a stranger in control of her house. Richard then took her to her bedroom. There, away from her family, he tied her down, sexually assaulted her, and took her life away. Later that day, Albert Luna Sr. returned from work. Just like the others, Richard met him with the gun, forced into the master bedroom, violently attacked him, and left badly injured and unable to protect his family. Back in the kitchen, Patricia and Damien were still tied to their chairs, facing each other. At some point, Richard came back and told Patricia that her daughter was dead and that her husband was gone. Then he turned his attention to Damien and tried different ways to harm the boy, but things did not go as he planned. What Richard did not expect was that Albert was not finished. Albert somehow regained consciousness, managed to stand up, and made his way toward the kitchen with a small pocket knife. In a final act of courage, he tried to fight for his family and managed to injure Richard. For a brief moment, there was resistance, but it did not last long. Richard quickly took control again. He attacked Albert a second time and then shot him multiple times. Albert collapsed on the floor of his own home. At that moment, 3 members of the family had been attacked. Only Patricia and Damien were still alive, still tied to the chairs, still facing each other. It's at this point, according to people who later heard Richard's own words and statements, that he asked Patricia the question,
"Do you want to watch your kid die? Or do you want your kid to watch you die?"
That is not the question of someone who lost control. That is the question of a cold-blooded and ruthless killer. Not long after that, he shot both Patricia and Damien. All 4 members of the Luna family were now dead inside their home. Before leaving, Richard tried to destroy what he had done. He poured gasoline around parts of the house, turned on the stove, and placed a pizza box and a rag on the burner, hoping a fire would start and erase the scene. Then he took the family's car, drove away, and later told his girlfriend a made-up story that he had been stabbed by 2 men at a shopping mall. For almost 7 hours, Richard Kenneth Djerf turned revenge into a process, tying, threatening, assaulting, experimenting, and killing, step by step. This is what makes the crime so disturbing. He wasn't acting in seconds or minutes. He had hours to stop, but he never did. Although Richard Kenneth Djerf tried to clean up his trail and step back into the outside world as if nothing had happened, there was one problem he couldn't erase. During the struggle in the kitchen, Albert Luna Sr. had managed to stab him with a small pocket knife. Richard left that night with a real injury, and he needed help for it. That wound and the questions around it helped investigators connect him to crime. Soon after, Richard was arrested and charged with killing all 4 members of the Luna family. What happened next in court showed how he saw himself and the system. Instead of quietly letting defense lawyers handle everything, Richard fought for the right to represent himself. He challenged the court, saying he wanted to speak for himself and control his own case. Judges had to decide whether he was mentally competent to do that. In the end, they ruled that he was. He wasn't claiming insanity. He wasn't saying he didn't understand his actions. He wanted control, even in front of the judge. In August 1995, Richard pleaded guilty to 4 counts of first-degree murder. As part of that deal, other charges like kidnapping, theft, assault, sexual assault, burglary, and attempted arson were dropped. But the 4 murders alone were enough to decide his future. On May 22, 1996, the judge sentenced him to death for each of the 4 killings, for separate death sentences. In court, Richard reportedly reacted with a cold, almost mocking line, "They can only kill me once." It was a short sentence, but it showed how he viewed the outcome, not with open emotion, but with dark sarcasm. Over the years, his case moved through the appeal system. His name appeared in legal discussions because of big decisions about how death sentences should be decided in Arizona, and for a time, his execution was put on hold. His attorneys argued different things over the years, including that he may have been on the autism spectrum and that the justice system hadn't fully understood him at trial. But none of that changed the core fact of the case. Richard had admitted to the killings. The courts kept his death sentences in place. By the time the 2020s arrived, his state and federal appeals were basically exhausted. In the end, as the state moved again toward carrying out his sentence, Richard himself stopped asking for any more chances. About a month before his execution date, he wrote a handwritten statement. In it, he accepted responsibility and said he would not seek clemency. He wrote, "If I can't find reason to spare my life, what reason would anyone else have? I hope my death brings some measure of peace." For a man who once tried to control everything, from how the crime unfolded to how the trial was run, This was the moment where control finally left his hands. The law had taken its course. All that remained was the last step. More than 30 years after the murders, the state of Arizona set a date to carry out Richard Kenneth Djerf's sentence. On the morning of October 17, 2025, at the Arizona State Prison Complex in Florence, the long legal journey finally reached its end. After 10 a.m., officials began the process. Richard was taken into the execution chamber and strapped to the table. A medical team started working to place the 4 lines in his arms so the chemicals could be given. It wasn't quick. According to prison officials, Richard's veins were not optimal. The team had to make several attempts before the 4 was set correctly. They started around 10:05 a.m. and were not finished until 10:21 a.m. Once the lines were in place, the injections began. The state used pentobarbital, a powerful sedative. Witnesses said that after the first dose started flowing, Richard took a few deep breaths and made a brief snoring sound. There was no struggle, no resistance. When he was asked if he had any last words, he simply replied, "I do not." No members of the Luna family were present to watch the execution, but others were. Arizona Attorney General Chris Mays observed the process and later said that this day should be about the 4 innocent victims and the loss their loved ones had carried for 32 years. Maricopa County Attorney Rachel Mitchell called the crime pure evil and said that some acts are so cruel that justice demands the ultimate punishment. Richard's last meal had been simple and very human. A double cheeseburger with lettuce and tomato, onion rings with ketchup, a slice of cherry pie with whipped cream, and a 20-ounce Pepsi with ice. By 10:28 a.m., the final injection was complete. At 10:40 a.m., Richard Kenneth Djerf was pronounced dead. Outside the prison, life went on as normal. Cars passed, people went to work, the world kept moving. But for the state of Arizona, for the investigators who never forgot the scene inside the Luna home, and for the only surviving son, this was the official end of a story that had started in 1993. The man who turned revenge into a 7-hour nightmare was now gone. But the questions about what he did and why he kept going when he had so many chances to stop would not disappear as easily. When you step back and look at this case from the beginning to the end, one thing becomes clear. It begins with one choice, a man who decided that revenge mattered more than human life. A stolen gun, some missing electronics, a broken friendship. Most people would argue, call the police, or walk away. But Richard Kenneth Djerf turned his anger into a plan to destroy an entire family. He even not claiming insanity. He knew what he was doing, and he admitted it. The law responded with 4 death sentences, decades of appeals, and finally, an execution more than 30 years later. Did that bring justice? Maybe in the legal sense. But the Luna family is still gone. The only surviving son still carries that loss. Turn out, revenge didn't fix what was stolen from Richard. It only created a tragedy that can never be undone. 6. Anthony Todd Boyd, State, Alabama, executed by nitrogen gas. July 31st, 1993, Anniston, Alabama. Gregory New York Hughley found burned to death at a baseball field in Munford. What began as a dispute over a $200 drug debt became a crime that would haunt this case for decades. More than 30 years later, the story ended with the execution of Anthony Todd Boyd, carried out by nitrogen gas at Holman Correctional Facility. But the case did not end cleanly. It leaves 5 serious questions about what happened in court, which we're going to discover in this video. Before looking at the crime itself, it's important to understand who the victim was and how the people involved were connected to him. The victim was Gregory New York Hughley, 32 years old, living in Anniston, Alabama. Hughley was known in his area, and his name later became central to a dispute tied to drug activity. Based on police investigations and court records, authorities concluded that 4 men were involved in the events that led to Hughley's death. Those 4 were Sean Ingram, Marcel Ackles, Keentary Cox, and Anthony Todd Boyd. According to testimony presented at trial, there was no long-standing feud no family connection, and no evidence of a personal vendetta between them. The conflict just centered on a $200 cocaine debt. Prosecutors argued that Hughley was believed to have taken drugs without paying, and that the crime was a result of group retaliation meant to punish and send a message. In other words, the motive described in court was collective, not personal, an act driven by money, drugs, and control rather than a personal hatred between individuals. This background formed the foundation of the case the state would later present to the jury. According to court records and trial testimony, the events of that night happened quickly. On July 31st, 1993, Gregory, New York, Hughley was approached on the street in Anniston. Ingram stepped out of a blue Astro van, holding a gun, and ordered Gregory to get inside. Gregory begged, "Don't kill me, just beat me." Then they drove him to a baseball field in Munford, Alabama, a quiet place with no witnesses. There, Gregory was taken out of the van, taped to a wooden bench, and doused with gasoline. When the match was lit, the flames spread instantly. The men watched as Gregory burned in the darkness of the field. The next afternoon, on August 1st, a local resident checked the field before a softball game. Under an oak tree, he found a burned body lying next to a scorched wooden plank. The sheriff's department was called immediately. Medical examiners identified the body as Gregory Hughley. They also confirmed that he was alive when the fire began, as he had breathed in smoke before he died. This story, the one the jury heard, came mostly from witness testimony presented by the prosecution. It was the backbone of the state's case, explaining how a dispute over money ended in extreme violence. But when this account was later examined in court, it raised serious questions about the accuracy of the story, particularly regarding the man at the center of today's video, Anthony Todd Boyd. After Gregory Hughley's burned body was found at the Munford baseball field, investigators from the Talladega County Sheriff's Department began retracing his final hours. At first, there were no physical clues pointing to a suspect. No fingerprints at the scene matched the victim or any known individuals. The investigation instead moved through interviews and street-level questioning. In the weeks that followed, police focused on a group of young men from Anniston who were believed to have had a dispute with Hughley over money. One by one, for names emerged: Sean Ingram, Marcel Ackles, Keintari Cox, and Anthony Todd Boyd. Boyd was 23 years old when officers came looking for him. According to family accounts, he voluntarily spoke with police, believing he had nothing to hide. Soon after, he, along with the other three men, was formally arrested and charged. At that stage, the case still lacked forensic evidence. The arrests were made before a complete physical case was established, setting the stage for a prosecution that would later rely heavily on testimony rather than material proof. With the arrests made, the case moved quickly into the courtroom, and almost immediately, something unusual appeared. This case wasn't built on DNA, fingerprints, or a clear forensic trail. It was built on testimony. The prosecution's case against Boyd hinged entirely on the testimony of Keintari Cox, a co-defendant who changed his story to save his own life. In his initial statement to police in October 1993, Cox admitted that he was inside the van with the group the entire time. But after striking a plea deal to avoid the death penalty, his narrative shifted conveniently. He suddenly claimed he had driven his own car separately, distancing himself from the abduction, while placing Boyd directly in the center of the brutality. It was only in this revised testimony that Cox specifically accused Boyd of duct taping the victim's feet, a damning detail that turned Boyd from a passenger into an active participant in the murder. This change was critical because it allowed Cox to minimize his own role while pinpointing Boyd as a primary aggressor. This accusation became the cornerstone of the state's case, but it was never mentioned until Cox needed to save himself from the electric chair. In March 1995, Boyd went on trial in Talladega County for capital murder during a kidnapping, a charge that could end in a death sentence, even if Boyd wasn't the one who lit the match. Beyond Cox's questionable plea deal, the prosecution's case relied on a handful of other eyewitnesses. but their stories were riddled with contradictions. These witnesses couldn't agree on fundamental facts. Was Boyd actually in the van? Who was holding the gun? Was it dusk or pitch black outside? One witness who placed Boyd at the scene was even contradicted by her own family, who testified she was miles away at the time. With absolutely no physical evidence, the jury was forced to weigh a man's life against a chaotic mess of changing memories and conflicting timelines. When the courtroom turned to physical evidence, it still did not show Boyd's involvement in the murder of Hughley. Investigators testified that fingerprints lifted from items near the scene did not match Boyd or the other defendants, and the medical testimony directly undermined the star witness. Cox said Boyd taped the victim's feet, but the autopsy revealed duct tape only on the victim's face and arm, with no evidence of tape on the legs. The jury was asked to convict Boyd based on a story that the physical evidence proved was scientifically impossible. Still, in 1995 trial, Boyd steadfastly denied involvement, maintaining he was elsewhere, first at a birthday party and later at a motel with his girlfriend. He had witnesses ready to prove it, but in court, that support never materialized. His court-appointed lawyer admitted to being severely underprepared, and the key witnesses who could have corroborated the alibi were never called to the stand. Despite the doubts, the jury returned a split 10-2 decision, sentencing Boyd to death. But the true injustice was revealed in the years that followed, as the four men met vastly different fates. Sean Ingram joined Boyd on death row. Marcel Ackles received life without parole. But Keeney E. Cox, the man whose shifting testimony built the state's entire case, paid the smallest price. He was rewarded for his cooperation and walked out of prison a free man in 2009. While his accuser went home, 23-year-old Boyd was left weeping in the courtroom, holding on to the only thing he had left. "I'll maintain my innocence until the day I die." For decades, Boyd fought his conviction, filing appeal after appeal regarding the unreliable witnesses and the evidence his jury never heard. Yet, he was never granted a new trial to fully re-examine the facts. But beyond the legal battles, Boyd's case drew attention to the history of the background was the local context, Talladega County's history as a heavy death sentencing jurisdiction, and the wider historical racial imbalance in capital punishment there. Ultimately, this case became about more than just the events of 1993. It was a question of how the system was built, whose word was valued, and whether justice was truly blind. October 23, 2025, William C. Holman Correctional Facility, Atmore. 30 years after the fire in Munford, the state of Alabama was ready to collect its debt. Anthony Todd Boyd was executed by nitrogen gas hypoxia, a controversial execution method in Alabama. In those final hours, he received visits from close family and his spiritual advisor, Reverend Jeff Hood, who had been a consistent presence throughout Boyd's time on death row. They gathered not just to say goodbye, but to stand witness to the life he was about to lose. At that day, Boyd accepted a simple breakfast tray, but refused lunch and dinner. He refused to choose a final meal to spend his final hours in conversation with his family and spiritual advisor. At 5:50 p.m., the curtain opened. Boyd was strapped to the gurney, a blue gas mask secured tight against his face. When the warden asked for his last words, Boyd didn't ask for forgiveness. He demanded the truth. "I didn't kill anybody. I didn't participate in killing anybody." His voice was steady, cutting through the tension in the room. "There is no justice in the state. It's revenge motivated. Let's get it." At 5:57 p.m., the nitrogen gas began to flow. Boyd's body clenched. He began to heave, deep, shuddering gasps that shook his frame. His spiritual advisor, standing by his side, placed a hand on him as the convulsions continued. For 15 minutes, the room was filled with the sight of a man fighting to breathe. It was the longest execution by this method the state had ever seen. At 6:33 p.m., Anthony Todd Boyd was pronounced dead. The curtain closed, leaving the witnesses in a heavy, suffocating silence. Psychologists say that in the end, The body fights to live even when the mind is ready to go. But Boyd's final struggle left a haunting question hanging in the air. Was that the thrashing of a guilty man facing his punishment? Or was it the desperate gasping of an innocent man, silenced by a system that refused to listen? When the lights went out in that chamber, the questions did not. Some feeling justice was finally delivered, others feeling the system moved forward while doubt still existed. And maybe that is the real wound this case leaves behind. Not just what happened, but the fear that we still don't fully know what was certain and what was assumed. 7. Norman Mearle Grim Jr. State, Florida. Executed by lethal injection. On July 27, 1998, in East Milton, Florida, a young attorney vanished only minutes after speaking with police at her home. Hours later, fishermen pulled her body from the waters beneath the Pensacola Bay Bridge. She was beaten with a hammer, stabbed 11 times in the chest, and wrapped in layers of sheets and tape. The killer is her next-door neighbor, Norman Mearle Grim Jr., who carried a long history of violence toward women. This is a case of Norman Grim, and the morning when a neighbor revealed who he truly was. Cynthia Campbell was a 36-year-old attorney living in East Milton, Florida. She was described as focused, responsible, and kind to people around her. Her home was quiet. Her life was stable, and nothing suggested she was in danger. But she lived next door to a man few truly understood. Norman Mearle Grim Jr., born in 1960, appeared ordinary on the surface. He worked steady jobs, kept to himself, and didn't stand out in the neighborhood. But behind that quiet exterior was a long history of violence, a pattern that stretched back decades. Records show that Grim had attacked women before. He had dragged one woman into a car, broken into homes, threatened another with a knife, and even pulled a 14-year-old girl into the woods before being chased off. His past was full of control, intimidation, and sudden bursts of aggression. Psychologists often say that people like Grim learn to blend in. They function just enough to appear normal, while their violent impulses stay hidden beneath the surface. Grim fit that pattern almost perfectly. After years in and out of prison, in both Florida and Texas, he eventually returned to East Milton and moved into the home beside Campbell's. There is no evidence they were friends, no sign of a personal relationship. They were simply neighbors, connected only by the thin walls of suburban life. But for someone like Grim, opportunity mattered more than familiarity. And on the morning of July 27, 1998, that opportunity would arrive. Just before sunrise, the quiet neighborhood on Nimitz Road was disturbed by an unexpected noise. Cynthia Campbell woke to the sound of breaking glass. Someone had thrown a chrome lug nut through her window. It was unusual for the area, and she immediately called the Santa Rosa County Sheriff's Office. When deputies arrived, they found Cynthia standing outside, and standing with her was her next-door neighbor, Norman Mearle Grim Jr. Grim spoke calmly, almost too comfortably for someone standing at a scene of damage. He told deputies he was the one who noticed the broken window, and as the officers finished their report, Grim made a small suggestion. He invited Cynthia over for coffee. Nothing dramatic, nothing alarming, just a quiet offer that, at the time, didn't feel dangerous. Cynthia declined, and the deputies left around 5:51 a.m. But only minutes later, something strange happened. A tree branch suddenly broke and fell onto Cynthia's car. Grim returned, checked on her, and repeated his invitation. This time she agreed. It seemed harmless. 2 neighbors, 2 cups of coffee, a stressful morning. But for Cynthia, that was the moment everything changed. After stepping into Grim's house, she would never be seen alive again. Around 7:20 a.m., one of Cynthia's co-workers stopped by to drop off some paperwork. She immediately sensed something was wrong. The front door was open. The lights were still on. Cynthia's car was exactly where it always was. But the house was silent. Too silent. She called out for Cynthia several times, waited, and left with a growing sense of unease. By 9 a.m., Another co-worker returned after Cynthia failed to appear at work. What she saw only deepened the alarm. Cynthia's keys were inside. Her dog was still in the home. Yet Cynthia was nowhere. Deputies were called back. They spoke again with Grim, and this time, things felt different. Grim seemed uneasy. Officers noticed reddish-brown stains on his shoulder and on the cut-off jean shorts he was wearing. Grim said it was primer paint from his car, but the deputies didn't fully believe that answer, even if they couldn't yet prove otherwise. Not long after, Grim asked for permission to go retrieve his 2 dogs, saying they had gotten loose. Deputies followed him in their patrol car, but instead of returning home after picking up the dogs, Grim began driving through Pensacola in a way that seemed intentional, turning repeatedly, switching streets, creating distance. Eventually, he slipped out of the deputy's sight. In criminal psychology, this type of behavior is common in offenders who feel pressure closing in. The instinct is not to explain, it's to escape. Around 1 p.m., a former co-worker happened to see Grim at the Pensacola Bay Bridge. Grim's car was parked on the bridge with the trunk open and all the doors open. He wasn't in distress. He wasn't calling for help. He was simply there, as if managing something he didn't want anyone else to see. Later that afternoon, between 3 and 3:30 p.m., 2 fishermen at the bridge felt something heavy catch on their lines. When they pulled it from the water, they made a discovery that changed the course of the entire investigation. They had found a human body, carefully covered in layers of sheets, trash bags, tape, and even a piece of green carpet. The body was Cynthia Campbell. With that discovery, the entire direction of the investigation shifted. The way she had been covered suggested intention, not panic, not an accident. And based on the morning's events, Grim was no longer just a neighbor who seemed concerned. He was now the last person known to have seen her alive. By the end of the day, investigators had pieced together enough of the timeline to realize something critical. Cynthia had entered Grim's home after deputies left, and she had never walked out again. Once Cynthia was formally identified, detectives moved fast. They obtained a warrant to search Norman Grim's home, and the moment they stepped inside, the story of that morning began to reveal itself. In the kitchen, 2 mops were still damp, as if someone had cleaned in a hurry. Small traces of blood dotted the floor, the lower cabinets, and a striped pillowcase thrown into the trash. A pair of jean shorts carried faint stains that would later be confirmed as Cynthia's. On a box of trash bags, detectives found 2 distinct fingerprints left in blood. And in the living area, a length of rope matched the same type used to bind the layers surrounding Cynthia's body. When investigators stepped out to the back porch, they found a rolled piece of green carpet, the same kind wrapped around Cynthia when fishermen discovered her. It was becoming clear. The materials used to cover her weren't random. They came from inside Grim's home. But the most revealing discovery waited outside. Hidden near the house was a cooler, dirty, out of place, and strangely heavy. Inside, detectives found what would become the core of the case: a knife, a hammer, rolls of tape, a blood-stained cloth, men's underwear, a tampon, and Cynthia's prescription glasses. Almost every item carried her DNA. The cooler showed a fact he tried to hide the evidence, hoping no one knew what he had done. By the end of the night, the evidence formed a timeline that matched what investigators suspected. Cynthia had entered Grim's home shortly after deputies left, and she never walked out again. But Grim wasn't at the house anymore. He had vanished. Detectives began searching across county lines, and 4 days later, they found him in Garber, Oklahoma, hiding with relatives. He was arrested without incident. When the case went to trial in October 2000, the prosecution presented the evidence: the timeline, the DNA, the materials used to cover the body, the stains in the home, the inconsistencies in Grim's story, and the attempt to evade law enforcement. The picture that emerged was not one of an accident or a moment of chaos, but a deliberate act followed by an effort to conceal it. Grim's prior history of violent attacks on women, including choking, kidnapping attempts, and breaking into homes, weighed heavily in the courtroom. The jury saw a pattern, not an isolated act. And what made the trial even more striking was Grim's own choice. He refused to present any mitigating evidence during sentencing. No witnesses. No psychological explanation. No plea for mercy. On November 1st, 2000, the jury found him guilty of first-degree murder and sexual battery. On November 2nd, after deliberating, they recommended death, unanimously 12-0, and on December 21st, 2000, the judge formally sentenced him to die. For the next 25 years, appeals came and went, but none changed the outcome. Grim continued to challenge the legal structure of Florida's death penalty, yet every court, state and federal, upheld the sentence. In 2025, in a quiet courtroom, Grim waived his final appeals. He chose not to fight anymore. The investigation that began with a broken window and a missing neighbor had reached its final destination. The evidence spoke for itself, and the justice system followed it to its conclusion. Governor Ron DeSantis signed the death warrant soon after, scheduling Grim's execution for October 28th. The morning of the execution was quiet. According to the Department of Corrections, Grim woke up at 6 a.m. He was served a final meal: fried pork chops, mashed potatoes, and a chocolate milkshake, a heavy, almost nostalgic combination. He ate alone. He had no visitors. He refused a spiritual advisor, and he made no attempts to leave behind a final message. At 6 p.m., witnesses gathered behind the glass of the execution chamber at Florida State Prison. Grim was already strapped to the gurney, his arms secured, the 4 lines in place. When asked whether he wanted to make a last statement, he answered with only 2 words: "No, sir." It was a quiet end for a man whose crime had shattered an entire community. At 6:13 p.m., he stopped moving. A medic checked his vitals. And at 6:14 p.m. or 6:15 p.m., depending on the agency's record, Norman Mearle Grim Jr. was pronounced dead. Inside the chamber, the atmosphere was described as silent and procedural. Outside, life continued as usual. Cars moved along the highway. The prison lights hummed. Yet for those who remember the morning Cynthia Campbell disappeared, her co-workers, the deputies who responded, the investigators who followed the trail, this moment carried a different weight. It marked the end of a 27-year story. A story that began with a broken window at dawn and ended in a fluorescent room at dusk. Whether Grim met this moment with acceptance or resignation, no one truly knows. But the way he faced his final hours, distant, detached, and without a word, echoed a pattern seen throughout the case. A man who separated himself from the harm he caused, right up to the end. With Grim's execution, the legal chapter of this case finally closed, but the pain didn't disappear. For the courts, the story was clear, but for the community it was devastating. What remains harder to understand is the person behind the crime. Grim lived an ordinary life on the surface, yet his past showed a pattern. Sudden attacks, attempt to overpower women, and efforts to flee when things went wrong. And even when facing the death penalty, Grim revealed little. No apology, no explanation. He waived his final appeals and walked toward the end in silence. Whether that was acceptance or emotional distance, only he knew. In the end, this case leaves us with a reminder. Sometimes the most dangerous people are the ones who hide in plain sight. And a single morning can change everything. This was the case of Norman Mearle Grim Jr., a neighbor who seemed ordinary until one morning revealed who he truly was. From a broken window at dawn to an execution decades later, every part of the story reminds us how quickly trust can turn into danger and how long justice can take to reach its final step. That concludes the executions carried out in October 2025. Whether you see this as justice or something more troubling, these cases continue to shape the national conversation. Share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to as we continue examining the executions still ahead.